All right, so let's stay with the story and look at the rights of the victims, especially when you look at the videos that have been circulating on social media, especially after this particular incident. We saw people injured, people in, very difficult conditions. So what does the law then say when it comes to sharing of such material? Let's speak now to Melusi Xulu, founder of Donda Attorneys. Melusi, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I mean, when one looks at this particular incident and what then happened, shortly thereafter, there were visuals of some of the people who were burnt and they didn't really look okay, but people were sharing them on social media. Let's talk about this and the violations thereof.
Good afternoon to you, Bomi, and good afternoon to the viewers at home. Firstly, before I answer the question, I would like to say condolences to the families of those who were lost in this tragic accident, and may those who are in hospital heal, and may God's grace cover them. In terms of, the violations, there is a POPI Act called Personal Protection of Personal Information Act. It's called POPI. It says one cannot share a personal information of a person, what they call it data subject in the Act, without the consent of that person. So if a person is having a tragic situation like it happened on the eve of Christmas, you can't share that picture without their consent, and there will be a violation in terms of that. It can be an imprisonment or a fine. However, I must state that there is an exclusion to that. If it's for journalistic purposes, if it's done by a journalist, it can be shared for those reasons. I suppose it's for public interest, but it can't be shared by anybody else. I think that is where the real concern should be, that no one can just share those photos. If you remember, if you check in one of the stories, there was a person who was burnt and he was asking for help. And the person who was taking a video, he just said, you should go to the hospital. But he was continuing, taking the video of a very painful situation that person's lives. So I think people should be, they should have empathy or sympathy towards people in those situations, and they should not share those personal situations or information.
So when we talk about personal information, I mean, people often think that this is data, this is information, but listening to you then, a face of someone may qualify as the sharing of their personal information.
That's correct. Because if you look at Section 2 of this Act that I'm talking about, it defines what is personal information, and photos are also one of those things that are defined as personal information. So you can't just share things without consent, because that is clearly stated in Section 11 of the POPI Act, where it says a data subject, which is the person who has that personal information, must give consent to his personal information being shared by whoever wants to share it, unless though it's for journalistic purposes. I must repeat that. It's stated in Section 7. But you can't just share things without any consent from the person. So a face or a photo is personal information, and you can't share it without the consent.
All right. And I do understand Advocate Zanyiwe Nthatisi, CEO of Digitally Legal, has now joined this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to then come to you with this very question, Advocate Nthatisi, because one of the things that, we often see is that people use the excuse that, but I didn't share this on Twitter, I didn't share this on Facebook, I merely shared it on my, WhatsApp status. Does that also, constitute the sharing of these images that one shouldn't be sharing?
So that question is an important one. If you are part of that value chain, so you may think about it as being the farmer who has grown the crop. That crop goes to a supermarket. That supermarket goes to a restaurant. Everybody in there is part of that food chain. And that's the same with images that have been captured and that are being shared. If you happen to be anybody that sends it to anybody that consumes or sees that content, you are indeed part of that value chain of processing.
And when one then looks at this, so what then becomes, the responsibility of someone like myself? Let's say I'm not even a journalist and I'm coming to a scene and I'm taking photos and I'm thinking that maybe this is going to be able to assist either police or anything like that. Do I then have responsibilities as I'm taking these particular pictures? And I'll bring it back to you, Advocate Nthatisi.
So that's a great question, right? We live in this age where an image can assist a medical practitioner or an emergency service staff to understand what's happening on the scene or with a particular injured person. So if you look at the purpose intended, why that picture was taken, if you look at why it was sent, someone can justify it, but it needs to happen within that parameter, within the bounds of what that initial good purpose was. But what we happen to find is whether it's sending it to that emergency assistant or medical practitioner, then those people sending it beyond what you initially sent it for, then they would obviously find themselves in trouble. So you really need to look at, why am I sending this thing? Who am I sending it to? What is the purpose intended? And if you can, rightfully stand up and justify why, then you probably won't find yourself on the wrong side of the road. But a lot of the times it's not because of that. People want to show that I was the first one on the scene. People want to talk about this horrible thing. People want to trend. And if you look at, I think my colleague had just explained quite nicely, that the Data Protection Act in South Africa protects people, protects individuals. Any information that can identify or trace you back to an individual, that is protected. But also the Cybercrimes Act speaks about dignity. And some of the images that are being shared, it really impairs the dignity of individuals, and it takes away from this entire healing process. Can you imagine being in this situation and you're seeing images, one of yourself or your loved ones or the scene itself? That itself, really goes against the rights of privacy and the rights people have in this country.
So then, Melusi, what then becomes the responsibility of someone who receives this particular video from maybe, let's say, someone at the scene, or it's going around and they're getting it from a multiple number of people? What must people then consider before they even begin to post this on social media?
I think what my lay colleague is saying is very important. Consider the dignity of the person of whose personal information we are sharing, because the whole purpose of the acts that we're talking about mostly today, the POPI Act, is to protect private information of the person in terms of the Constitution. I think it's Section 14, sorry. So I think just consider that, consider the dignity of the person and have conscience, because here's my concern. I don't know if my colleague will agree or add to that. I think the cyber law acts or legislation in our country, they are not sufficient. Maybe they are good in writing, but they are not practical, or they've not been implemented practically. I've not seen them being implemented in criminal law for the last 3 years when they've been implemented. So I think there's a difficulty of that. So I think it comes down to the conscience of a person who has that data to say, is it right for me to do this? What if it was me who was in that situation? Because when it comes to the acts, whether it's the Cybercrime Act or it's the POPI Act, I think sometimes I've not seen it being implemented practically in courts. And I think people are taking advantage of that.
Yeah.
So as a person gets information, and we're living in a cloud age, if I would call it that. Person says, oh, this is a way to, get some followers or, to trend, as my colleague was saying, then they'll share. So I think it all comes down to conscience, and hopefully the people who are in positions to implement these acts, I think there's time that they must implement them, because we always talk of the same thing. Remember, I think a month ago, there was private information that was shared of a certain political leader, and nothing was done. So I think we're having challenges of implementation, and people are taking advantage of that. But as I'll repeat, it comes down to the conscience of the person who has that information or is taking the video.
And Advocate Zanyiwe, I'll give you the last bite here. Let's talk about the rights and the implications of this, especially when you look at it in the context of, the families of the victims, because some of those unfortunately have passed away. What then do they have in terms of rights? Can they sue? And if they sue, who it is? If they can't, what then happens in this particular regard?
When it comes to Poppy, that itself would be for the living individual who would have the right to enforce. And in that case, the individual would have to be alive and they'd have to do that themselves. But I think from a family perspective, there's definitely an element of keeping the social media platforms responsible. So there has been quite a big shift over the past couple of months in South Africa where you can get information of people who are sending information or pictures, identifiable information of individuals. So they can definitely go to the courts, and the courts can allow for further investigations and allow for information to come up, so that those particular individuals that are spreading all these images that do bring up all this pain and also, I guess, create this undignified experience for individuals can be brought to task. From a cybercrimes perspective, you really need to look at what the content is. And I think, as my colleague had said, what is the purpose intended? Who was this sent to? Is it being sent virally for fun, for banter, just for people to share that? That in itself is a cybercrime. So the courts are really ready now. And I think my colleague had said that there hasn't been a lot of cases, there isn't a lot of case law that speaks to implementation. But after Section 20 of the Cybercrimes Act was put into play, and people can actually use IP addresses to track perpetrators down, or potential or alleged perpetrators down, I think there really is some movement in the right direction from a South African perspective.
All right, thank you so much for that, because, people take for granted what they're posting on social media, and sometimes there is not even a thought that is given before people can even post some of these things. Thank you so much for that. We do appreciate it. I hope someone has learned something, when it comes to sharing, especially when you are first at the scene. That was Advocate Zanyiwe Nthatisi, CEO, Digitally Legal, and Melusi, Xulu, founder of Donda Attorneys.